economists and politicians are decoding the economic jargon before the Treasurer's speech tonight. I'm Patricia Karvelas, live from the lands of the Ngunnawal people in Canberra. Welcome to a budget special of Afternoon Briefing. The Treasurer will hand down his fourth federal budget for this term of Parliament tonight, showing a deficit and no timeline for a return to surplus. Many of the larger measures have been announced already, including another $150 off household and small business power bills from July, costing the budget $1.8 billion. Will this be an election springboard? I'll speak to politicians from all sides about their budget wish lists. Donald Trump says he might give a lot of countries breaks from reciprocal tariffs set to be announced next week. The US President says tariffs targeting industrial sectors like automobiles and pharmaceuticals are coming, but declined to say when they would be announced. So does that mean Australia will get the carve-outs it's been asking for? I'll ask the Finance Minister, Katy Gallagher, in just a moment. And a US magazine editor appears to have been sent sensitive military plans after the President Donald Trump's national security team accidentally included him in their group chat. The group appeared to include cabinet secretaries and top aides, including Vice President JD Vance. A day after the journalist was added, the group began sharing information about plans for a military operation against the Iran-aligned Houthi rebel group. Well, we're broadcasting just outside the exclusive budget lockup as we wait to hear the Treasurer hand down his fourth federal budget. It's actually the first time this has happened in 80 years. Now, we're expecting to hear more on the cost of living relief that the government says it wants to offer. What we already know is that the government will extend its energy bill rebates until the end of the year, offering households $150 off their power bills from July. The budget will also include more funding to promote the government's Buy Australia policy, a response to the global uncertainty brought by the Trump administration. Now, I spoke to the Finance Minister, Katy Gallagher, earlier today, just before the lockup began. Minister, welcome to Afternoon Briefing.
Thanks for having me on.
The budget will be delivered in a couple of hours. The Treasurer tells us that the idea behind this budget is repair, relief and reform. We've heard a bit about repair from you. We've heard a bit about relief. Where's the reform coming from?
Well, you'll need to wait this evening to get the budget. Obviously, I'm not going to steal Dr. Chalmers' thunder by coming a bit early, but, you know, the picture of the budget really builds on all of those three themes, and it builds upon the budgets we've handed down before. So it's really a work in progress where we're chipping away, making investments, repairing the budget where we can, lowering debt, and making sure we can provide that cost of living relief to people while they're doing it tough. It tries to do a number of things, PK. Budgets always do that. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of decisions, that all interrelate to each other.
This is a very untraditional budget. I've covered, I don't think it's right to count them right now, but many budgets. Do you concede that this is essentially an election manifesto, Minister, rather than a traditional budget?
Well, I think it's a continuation of the work we started since coming to government in 2022, and you'll see that. So things like an example there is, when we tripled the bulk billing incentive, and now we're in this budget extending that to everybody. So you can see those sort of pieces fitting together. Yes, we're on the eve of an election, so this budget comes at a highly political time. I accept that. And budgets are always political in the sense that they are government's priorities that map out, where we've been and where we're going, and this budget does that.
One of the issues which I think your side of politics has conceded is just how long we forecast to be in deficit for. Are you comfortable with a decade of deficit?
Well, I think my job is to really work out how you repair the budget over time, and is to be honest and upfront with people that you can't just, I think, make decisions that flip that switch when you've got some of the pressures we've got, because doing that would mean that people would, experience hardship or harm. You wouldn't be able to fund Medicare. You wouldn't be able to provide support through income payments and things like that. And so I think part of my job is to continue to find savings. We've found about $95 billion during this term of government, but it's to obviously continue to work away and chip away to make sure that you're returning the budget to balance over time, but doing that in a way that doesn't hurt households.
And do you think a decade is the realistic timeframe, or would you, if you become finance minister again, would you seek to accelerate that timeframe?
Look, I think it's important to get the budget back into balance over time, and it's subject to decisions that need to be made in the future. But I think you can look at our record, which is we have found $95 billion worth of savings. The last budget before the last election found precisely zero. So I think we've put, our record matches the approach that we would take going forward, which is, you've got to find savings. You've got to make every taxpayer dollars stretch as far as it can go, but at the same time, make sure you're funding the services that people rely on.
There is a big discussion about what tax reform might look like for our country. I know what you've already done in government. You obviously redistributed the stage 3 tax cuts. And there's been some multinational tax reform. I'm going to say these things before you do, Minister.
Taking away my answer.
I am, but helping you out with, will you take, and I know you're not going to make all your announcements now, but just at a sort of macro level, will you take tax reform to the next election and seek a mandate for it, or is it something you think should happen in the next term through a conversation with the public over a next term?
Well, I think there's always lots of discussions about tax, and there's a lot of opinions about it, and we get it. It probably speeds up and becomes a bit more intense around budget time every year. I think, tax reform is hard work, and we've got measures in the Senate right now that we can't get through. We have 25 votes in the Senate. It's a chamber of 76, and we've got a very modest change to superannuation that's stuck there because we can't get a majority at the moment. And so I think we need to be realistic about that as well. We'll always look at how you balance the budget, how you make sure you can invest in services, look at how your revenue's coming together. But I think the tax debate we have in this country is pretty frank and healthy at the moment. We get a lot of free advice about that.
And some of that free advice might be terrible, but some is reasonable, and it's about the intergenerational challenge that we're having between generations. Young people increasingly saying they're feeling pretty bleak about their future. Given the trouble you're having over, as you describe it, a small measure, doesn't that mean you need to take things to an election to get a mandate, given when you've done it outside of that mandate, like this superannuation change, you've struggled?
Well, that's what we'll be doing with the superannuation change, and we did when we put it in. We made it clear that it would come into effect after the next election, so that, in a sense, we're doing exactly that. But even the changes to PRRT to bring that revenue forward from projects, that was hard work to get through the Senate. So I think my view is, we have to be realistic with the parliament that the people of Australia have elected, and, tax reform is difficult.
Now, you know that a budget is all about the sort of next day headlines, so to speak, or the next evening ones, given we live in a digital world. Are we just going to have headlines later tonight, after 7:30, after the Treasurer is on his feet delivering this in the Parliament, which are about debt and deficit, or is there more and hope that you're going to be providing that perhaps we haven't anticipated?
Well, you'll have to...
There's been a lot of low expectations about this budget. I'm just getting a sense if there's something that perhaps our viewers who are watching this before it's officially declared should be hopeful for.
Well, I unfortunately don't get to write the headlines because I'd probably write them a bit differently than you and your colleagues do, PK. But I think what they'll see is a budget that's been put together in pretty uncertain times, a lot of global uncertainty, pretty difficult times for households, so cost of living, but a very clear path about the future we'd like for this country. And I think there is a level of optimism in that, including the fact that, from a lot of the forecasts that you'll see in the budget show that the difficult times we've been through, there is a view that we've turned the corner, and that should bring hope and optimism to households as well.
I just want to talk to you about the Trump tariffs that look like they're coming. The opposition is saying that if you look at the detail of what the Trump administration, Donald Trump himself, is saying, we really aren't likely to be hit by the next round. Is that how you see it?
Well, we're continuing to engage with our US counterparts, obviously, and we'll do that through the diplomatic channels rather than through
No,
the media.
in terms of the view and the conclusion they've come to, which is that because we are, for instance, in a trade surplus, like we are in a different situation with the US, that they would not impose tariffs on us. Do you see it that way?
Yeah, well, the opposition have said a few things, haven't they? They were first out to blame and have a go politically rather than work in the interests of Australia, and now they're kind of trying to find their right spot again. Our position hasn't changed. Working in the national interest, engaging with the US. It is a different administration. They're coming out with a different view on a whole range of matters. We'll always stand up for the national interest.
But is it your sense that we will be hit by more tariffs?
All of our counterparts are actively engaged, PK. There isn't a thing that we could be doing that we are not doing in making sure we're standing up for Australian jobs, Australian industry and Australia's national interest, and we will continue to do that right up until the US make their decision.
Now, the independents are saying there's now preliminary legal advice on the salmon farming legislation that's been rushed through, saying it actually won't even pertain to this area because it's been rushed through so quickly. Could Labor have rushed through this legislation so fast for a political fix that you may have stuffed it up and it won't even work?
Well, that's not the advice the government has, so I'm not sure. I haven't seen what the independents are saying. This has been gone through our normal channels, through our normal drafting process and advice that government would get. And we think it is important to provide that certainty for jobs in that part of Tasmania. I've been down there, I've spoken to workers.
You don't think it's going to be subjected to legal challenge and it's a vulnerable piece of legislation?
Well, I think the legislation seeks to deal with that. And I think our commitment is to provide certainty to the people in that part of Tasmania, in northwest Tasmania. I mean, whole towns rely on industries like this. The school has all the children going to the school are connected to this industry, and it means a lot. And we stand up for jobs, and the legislation we've got deals with that. And yeah, we'll be getting it through the Parliament this week.
Final question, Minister, and I'm really stretching the friendship here and your generosity. You're also Minister for Women. You, in fact, have many hats. Will we see more in terms of women and work? I know you've been zeroing in on the coalition and the idea of women working from home. Will there be something there in the budget?
Well, there'll be...
It's your area, so you can't do the Treasurer won't let me.
Well, you'll see again, this is a big part of the building blocks from the first budget to this one. Every single budget we've looked at what we can do to shift the dial on women's economic equality. We've got women in work at the highest rates. We've peaked on workforce participation. The gender pay gap at the lowest record. We've got women earning $217 per week more because of those big pay rises in those feminised industries like aged care. We've got our big women's health package, a number of measures in women's safety. And, yeah, I mean, the approach that we'll take on working from home is one that reflects modern workplaces and how, you know,
most jobs... Would you like to see more of it?
More working from home?
Yep.
I want to make sure... Well, for me, it's about workplace flexibility, really, and any woman you speak to, you know, who has various responsibilities inside and outside of work, craves and values workplace flexibility. Some of that may be working from home, some of it may be the hours they work, some of it may be the place they work. All of that matters to women, and, you know, our government reflects modern Australia. We're more than half women in the caucus, and we value these things, and that's why that'll be the position we take.
And on Peter Dutton's plan for more people to go back to work in the public service, because that's specifically what his policy is about, do you think you will lose women from the public service if that policy was enacted?
Yes, I do. And I was in a Centrelink office a couple of weeks ago in northern Queensland in a call centre arrangement where it was very clear. They said if they didn't have flexible working arrangements and some capacity to work from home, they wouldn't be able to fill the jobs up there. So without a doubt. So
have you quantified it?
I wouldn't have, you know, it's anecdotal, but I know that in all the surveys that are done about what you want in work for the APS, workplace flexibility is often ranked higher than pay. That's how important it is to people.
Minister, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, every federal budget has its winners and its losers. And there are numerous lobby groups who are all vying to be part of the former. Let's bring in my first panel of today. Michelle O'Neill is the president of the ACTU, the Australian Council of Trade Unions, for the workers' perspective. And Luke Alkestratch is the CEO of COSBOA, representing small business. Welcome to both of you. So what's on your wish list today?
The COSBOA wish list is a shot in the arm for small business. You know, this is arguably the toughest operating environment for small business in living memory. Record insolvencies, energy, rent and insurance costs are through the roof. So what can we do in this budget to deliver incentive and certainty for small businesses? So the wish list starts with the instant asset write-off, which is an accelerated depreciation program. And every year it's been rolled over 1 year at a time. Now, we know that small businesses need 3 or 4 years of certainty. We really want to see that program made permanent and broader support for institutions like the ACCC to make sure there's a level playing field when it comes to competition, because we know at the moment small businesses are doing it really tough and they don't always have that market power or that big balance sheet of large enterprise.
So if you could get anything in tonight's budget, is the instant asset write-off being a longer term built into the budget something you want?
Yeah, we'd love to see that certainty, and small business and accountants and bookkeepers and all the other small business ecosystem that support and promote entrepreneurship in Australia have been unified in our call for this for a period of time. So it doesn't need to cost the budget much at all. And what it does, PK, is actually generate private investment. This isn't a handout, it's accelerated depreciation for a small business owner at the moment who's thinking, oh, what do the next 6 to 12 months look like? Do I employ that other person? Do I buy that additional piece of machinery? That extra incentive can really get them over the line and really get them spending and raising productivity for the entire country.
Michelle, there's been few tranches of industrial relations changes that have been legislated by the Albanese government. What else are you looking forward at this budget?
Well, the most important thing for workers in this budget, PK, is to see wages continue to rise. We've seen growth in real wages now. In fact, there's been more growth in the last 12 months than we saw under the 9 years of the previous coalition government. But there's more work to do to make sure that wages keep going up, because there's a lot of recovery that workers need to see. And a lot of that, of course, has gone to low-income workers, women, for example, who work in early childhood education and care and aged care. So we want to see wages continue to rise and the right levers in place to make sure that happens. A lot of the things that have been put into industrial relations are still starting to flow through. So we want to see those continue, and that really important lift in wages, which is the key cost of living measure.
But how do you build
people.
that in beyond the settings that the government has already established?
Well, I think there's a few things. One of the things I know that the government's been talking about and we'd love to see is to see those non-compete clauses banned. So these are these clauses that basically stop you being able to go and get a job in the industry that you've got skill and experience in. So you're a hairdresser, you can't go and work for another hairdresser because you've got a contract that says you cannot go and work for someone else. This is a real something that many other countries have banned. It would actually help improve wages for those sectors, and it's about 1 in 5 workers affected by it. So if we got rid of those non-compete clauses, then workers would be able to go and look for a job where they're paid better. That's going to lift those workers' wages by about 2.4%. But importantly, it also is a huge boost to productivity. And so everybody wins out of that.
The government is, I understand, looking at a proposal that's similar. We'll have to wait for the budget announcement. But Luke, would that be something you'd welcome?
Look, we need to get the balance right with respect to non-compete clauses. I suppose from a small business owner's perspective, of course, if you want to go out and start your own enterprise and be an entrepreneur, there needs to be scope for that. But equally, respecting the IP and the processes that person might have learnt on the job from that particular employer. So we're certainly involved in that consultation.
Are you a bit worried about the consequences, is what you're saying?
Possibly. We don't want there to be unintended consequences. We want the higher productivity. We want more people starting their own business. But we do just need to make sure there's the devil in the detail. He's not going to have unintended consequences for small businesses who have made that investment. So we look forward to ongoing consultation.
Just explain to me, Michelle, because I don't know if all of our viewers would necessarily understand the scenario you talked about. I know there's no compete clauses, I think, for people who are really high income earners, and that's different. But you say hairdressers. So hairdresser is obviously a skill that people get in training. It's a trade. Why can't you quit your job at a hairdresser shop and then get another job?
Well, bizarrely, these have creeped into employment contracts. So when you get a job in all sorts of industries now, it's in retail, it's in hairdressing, it's in disability services, like things you just would never believe. Many low-paid and medium-paid workers have an employment contract that says you can't go and work for somebody else, basically sell your labour to get a better deal for a long period of time after the period of time you worked for the first person. So it stops you saying, oh, I've learned a lot here. Look at that job over there that Luke's got. It's going to pay me a bit more. I'm going to go and work for Luke. It actually doesn't let you go in and get that job. So, as I said, it's been banned in many countries. You've seen improvements in productivity and wages from it. It's exceedingly non-competitive, which is why it amazes me a bit that not all of the employer organisations also support this. And, of course, you can make sure that people don't spread confidential information in different ways. This is not about that. This is actually saying your boss owns you, you're bonded. You know, you can't go off and find a better job. It's going to pay you better for the skills you've got.
That's an interesting point. I know that, for instance, with hairdressers, where there's, you know, a particular hairdresser takes clients that were signed up, right? That's where that has, many hairdressers have told me this, and that becomes a dispute. How do you think that should be dealt with?
Well, PK, what's interesting is a lot of these contracts aren't actually enforced. So they're often there as a bit of a incentive, and they don't necessarily get enforced, which I think also makes it really timely to go and look at these arrangements and are they working appropriately. And again, it's that risk-reward ratio. It's about making sure, yeah, potentially you're having clients taken away from a legitimate business that's invested in their staff. So I think we need to get that pub test part right, and we need to make sure that it works both ways for small businesses who are really reliant on skilled labour in a skills shortage at the moment, but at the same time making sure not just the opportunity to go and start their own business, but then where's the access to finance, where's the access to training, where's the access to good advice to help make sure that a lot of these people wanting to go out on their own actually have, you know, the 360-degree skill set they need to succeed in business.
Now, the other thing, of course, is that we are now stuck, it looks like, in deficits for a long period of time. I can't see, unless it's about to be revealed, a very obvious strategy for how to get out of this situation. Do we have to have some hard conversations, Michelle, about how we actually fund what looks like increasing spending? We've had many announcements, some of them very welcome, but if you're going to be spending more, you've got to work out how you're going to pay for it, don't you?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things, PK. Firstly, you think about what we're spending money on. I mentioned wages for some of the lowest paid workers that care for our eldest and youngest. We've been spending money on healthcare. So important that we expand bulk billing, that we have cheaper medicines. But also, we've been spending money on things like supporting those workers at Whyalla. We don't want to see 3,000 jobs lost there. Or supporting Rex Airlines. Like, we need regional airlines to keep operating. So these are important things we're spending money on. And if you look at Australia's expenditure, public expenditure comparative to like the US and the UK, proportionally we're actually significantly less. We're also lower than the OECD average. So when we're spending public money for public good, then I think that's something people support.
But we still have to be able to pay for it though, right? And we're in a structural deficit. So how do you deal with that?
Well, it's years of structural deficit ahead, PK. That seems to be the unanimous verdict. And you've had economists lining up saying we need to have a mature debate and conversation about this. Our view, 2.5 million small businesses in Australia, the more they succeed, the more revenue they generate and the more tax they pay. But we need those businesses actually firing. We need them being incentivised because they are the engine room of the economy. Every politician I've ever met says they want to cut red tape and that small business is the engine room of the economy. Well, let's put our money where our mouth is. Let's actually back them in, drive that competition, drive that productivity, which will help us drive living standards and help get the budget back into a better structural place.
Well, I'm going to let you both go because you're actually going into the budget lockup where you will surrender all of your phones and basically be subjected to just being stuck in a small space.
Really small space with
Treasury
a lot of people.
officials.
The longest we haven't been with our phones since we were...
Yeah.
Who knows when.
Enjoy yourself. Thank you to both of you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, PK.
The Coalition will deliver its budget reply speech later this week, but they've attacked the government for not having a plan to get the budget back into a structural surplus. I spoke to the Shadow Finance Minister, Jane Hume, earlier today. Jane Hume, welcome.
Good to be with you, PK.
You've talked a lot about how much you think Labor is taxing, but how would you tax less?
Well, in fact, Labor has taxed Australians more than they've ever been taxed before. The average taxpayer's paid around an additional $3,500 this year in tax alone. That's an extraordinary amount of money to pay. And for what? I mean, better services? That's questionable. So we want to reinstate those fiscal guardrails around the budget that have served Australians so well for so long. A tax to GDP ratio, which essentially contains the envelope in which you spend. That's really important, budget rule to maintain. We want to make sure that in the long term, expenditure doesn't grow faster than the economy. Again, that's the only way you'll ever bring the budget back into structural balance. If you don't do that, well, you're simply raising the white flag.
But that is a long-term sort of promise, if you like, rather than specific tax cuts or tax reform, isn't it?
Well, we've actually already announced a series of tax reforms. The first is we won't be supporting Labor's tax on unrealised capital gains. That's not only unfair, but it's also entirely unworkable.
We've said the changes to the superannuation.
Yeah. We've said that we will be extending the instant asset write-off threshold, so we'll increase that to $30,000, and we'll make the instant asset write-off a permanent feature of the tax system. That's a really important productivity measure because it allows small businesses in particular to invest in their productive capacity. We've also said that we'll allow for an FBT-free deductible meals, tax deduction on meals for small businesses. That helps not just small businesses, but it also, most importantly, helps the hospitality sector because that has been one of the hardest hit sectors in Labor's cost of living crisis. So it's a very modest proposal, but these are things that we've already announced. Now, there's more to come. Obviously, we'd like to do further tax reform, and I know that there are, voices around this building that want to talk big games on tax reform. The problem is, if you're an independent, you don't actually ever have to make hard decisions about what comes on the other side, how you have to pay for it.
There's a minority government and you can flex your considerable muscle in that space, which presumably might happen if you got into a position.
Well, that's
clearly
not something
Allegra Spender wants to push for real tax reform, not smaller measures.
I would love to see Allegra Spender or any other independent also push for expenditure constraint because Allegra Spender and all the other Teals voted in favour of changing the stage 3 tax reforms so that they actually essentially abandoned bracket creep reform, which was really important.
But am I right that you did too?
Well, we had to at the time.
Why?
Because Australians are facing a cost of living crisis that was caused by Labor. Now, we have said that we will support Labor to assist Australians that are really struggling, that are really doing it tough, but because of the decisions that they have made, inflation has stayed too high for too long. Interest rates have stayed too high for too long. And that's why we need to make sure that Australians get the help that they need. But
why
that doesn't necessarily mean
all of these spending measures that Labor has announced if you think we've got a spending problem?
Well, we backed in their health reforms because there's been a bulk billing crisis. There is a health crisis again
PBS,
in this government,
energy,
caused by problems that they have made. We've backed in energy relief because of problems in the energy system that they have made. And it's ordinary Australians that are paying the price in their hip pockets because of Labor's failed policies.
But do you see what I mean? Like, you're making the case that there's too much spending, and some people will be watching, being sympathetic to that idea, but you've backed in all the extra spending.
Well, we've also disagreed with around $100 billion worth of proposals, of measures that the government have proposed. Now, some of those, unfortunately, have got through with the help of other people around the building, but we've certainly opposed them. So we haven't backed in the government on all of their spending measures, far from it. What we want to see is fiscal restraint, and we've been saying that for 3 years, because if you don't show fiscal restraint when inflation is running out of control, and let's face it, it's not mission accomplished. We haven't fixed inflation yet. If you don't control that massive urge to spend, that's very Labor, well, then you're essentially making the problem worse. You're allowing inflation to continue higher for longer, and that means interest rates will stay higher for longer, and Australians will pay the price.
Peter Dutton's delivering his opposition leader's formal budget reply on Thursday night. Will there be something meaningful in terms of economic reform in that speech?
it's a very career-limiting move to make announcements about the budget and
You can
reply
limit
in
your career
advance
here
of the
on
budget and
afternoon
reply,
briefing.
so I will let the leader make it for himself. But what I will say is that it is not just a statement of values, it's also a statement of vision, a vision that the Coalition has for the Australian economy and for Australians themselves to make sure that we contain inflation, contain those cost of living, that cost of living crisis once and for all, and do so sustainably, to make sure that we get the economy back on track, deliver affordable housing, cheaper energy, quality healthcare, and keep our communities safe.
And a gas reservation policy?
Well, we've said that we will deliver cheaper,
Does that mean
cheaper
reserving
energy,
and
cheaper
breaking contracts perhaps?
Well, it
or I
certainly
can
means-
imagine industry, particularly in WA, won't be overwhelmed with happiness.
It certainly means that we need to put more gas into the system faster. So that will mean fast-tracking approvals. It's the only way to sustainably bring prices of energy down. Economics hasn't changed. It's still about demand and supply. At the moment, we have not enough supply. We must put more supply into the system. In the short term, that's gas. In the longer term, as coal-fired power stations retire, we'll replace those with zero-emissions nuclear energy, and that will bring down prices over time, as it has done in the developed world right across the globe.
I've spoken to colleagues of yours who tell me that women in their electorates are pretty cranky with this idea that working from home is, it's suggested that it's perhaps not real work and that it's having negative impacts in terms of how voters are responding. With the benefit of hindsight, was that framed wrong?
Well, that's a Labor lie. I mean,
I said your Liberal colleagues.
Yes, you may have, but here's the thing, it's a Labor lie, because the Liberals have never said that work from home is a bad thing. In fact, flexible work will always stay. To begin with, our policy doesn't apply to the private sector. We want
But it
the
sends
private
a signal if you're saying to the public service you want people to come
Labor
back to work.
are sending a signal. It's not us sending a signal. We want the private sector to make its own decisions, whatever works for them, whatever works for their productive capacity. But we also want to do what works for the public sector as well. Now, every public sector job is paid for by a taxpayer, so we have to meet their expectations. And at
But
the
if
moment,
workers are productive at home, why should they come back to work?
well, we want to make sure that they're productive at home. Now, most importantly, we're not going to dishonour any contracts or any arrangements that are already in place. But there is an expectation that if you take a job with the public sector, that it's a job that involves working from the office. Now, arrangements can always be made, but they have to work for the individual, for the team, and for the department. That's the most effective way that we can deliver an efficient public service.
Katy Gallagher says women will leave. There were women in the public service who'll leave. Is that perhaps helpful if you want to cut 36,000 public servants?
That is a scare campaign that is directly being, propagated by Labor.
But if you are forcing women back to work in the public service, I accept that that's, the caveat, like that is your policy. Why would they necessarily want to stay if that's a great arrangement
Patricia,
for their family?
I question why this is a gendered policy in the first place, because it applies to everybody.
And overwhelmingly,
what we've seen,
women have really enjoyed its benefits.
But what we're seeing is some egregious abuses of this power. And let's not forget that Katy Gallagher has done a review in this. She's asked the Public Service Commissioner to do a review into working from home arrangements herself, because 61% of the public service now have some form of working from home arrangements. That's so far off the mark to what the private sector is doing. So why should we not put the public sector and the private sector on an even playing field? If this is being turned into a scare campaign by Labor, well, shame on them, because to be honest, what the taxpayer deserves is an efficient and an effective public service that meets their expectations.
Jane Hume, always great to speak to you. Thank you.
Great to be with you, PK.
Senator Jacqui Lambie has been a vocal critic of the government deciding to extend the energy relief rebate, one of the key features of this year's federal budget. She says the bill should be means tested. That's the argument. She's not against the idea of people getting help. She just thinks it should be targeted. The Senator joins me now live in our very hot outside parliamentary studio. How are you going?
Jesus, I'll tell you what, it's hotter in here than what is that in that yoga room upstairs, I reckon.
It is. It's a bit like hot yoga. Let's do some hot yoga interview here.
Great.
Let's start with, we've got budget deficits for another decade. Is that acceptable to you?
You know what, I think we've had deficits before. We had the Liberal Party, I remember in their day, and remember we had those back to black. We had those mugs done, which were made in China, mind you. Let's raise that point. But those mugs just disappeared because it never happened. I think that the last people that Australians are worried about is going into a deficit. There are so many people hurting out there right now. But, you know, how much deficit do we have to get into? You know, we've got all that extra defence spending over there, all that procurement which needs to be looked at. We could halve that budget, and not because we don't need the money, but because of the waste. Okay, so, and for me, I just think, why do I need $150, PK? It's embarrassing. Anyway, I give mine out and I do something with mine. That's not an issue, but that's not the point. I just wonder if we'd have been means tested, we could have had half of that money left over, and we could have actually helped raise that New Start. There was billions of dollars spent on those energy relief package, and I just think we could have, you know, we could have done more about that. What about the councillors? Like, I've got tens of thousands of councillors out there, and because the Psychology Association and the Psychiatry Association are fighting over who should be top dog, these people, they won't put these councillors on the Medicare list. So when you say you're going to put more money into psychology out there, I say, well, that's great. It's not the money that is the problem, PK. We don't have the people on the ground. You know, I've got counsellors screaming out there to say, even if you just do it for a short period of time, but if patients want to come and see us, put them on the Medicare rebate, instead of them having to do things illegally and having to see people in those rural and regional areas and not charging them. Because right now that's what they're doing to help them.
We do definitely have an issue with having enough skilled workers to do some of these roles. Yeah. You're right. But in terms of us paying for a lot of... You're right, a lot of people are in need. From Medicare...
There's no skilled workers are here, though. They're counsellors.
OK, but in terms of the big funding announcements from the government on Medicare, on the PBS, I think a lot of people would think they're fair things that we're spending money on.
Yeah, they're absolutely fair.
But they might also ask, where are we getting the money from? So do we need to work out that part of the story?
I think it's really difficult at this point in time to predict anything, especially now that Trump's come into power in the US. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. You know, we've got a war sitting between Russia and Ukraine. We have a war going on in Gaza. There is a lot of instability around the world. I just think that trying to work all that out today would be really difficult. I think the best thing that the Labor Party could do is do what it's doing and go, who needs this money and can we get this out? And we're just going to have... I think we're going to go into a lot more pain and a lot more deficit because, you know, if they're not buying as much... of our resources anymore and things like we are going to continue to go into deficit, but we have to target where we're spending that money. This is the problem. Go spend the money. I don't have a problem with that to help those people living on or below the poverty line, but don't waste it and give it to people like me. That's just a waste. You know, and it's not the first time. This is the second time we've got this $150 or this energy supplement.
Do we need bigger tax reform though, Jacqui Lambie? Looking at things like, you know, young people are being penalised.
Yep.
They can't get ahead and other people can negatively gear many properties. There seems to be a disconnect in the community.
Yeah, absolutely, you know, and it's like the housing shortage. Sure, well, let's look at negative gearing. You know, let's grandfather what's already there to not upset that, because I always say when the government's made an agreement with you, it should stick to it. You can grandfather things like that. And do we just let people have two houses? But that's just, it's going to be 3 or 4 prolonged approach, not just one thing that's going to fix it.
This budget may not be this opportunity. We're on the cusp of an election. So be frank with me. Is this just, do you see this as just an election kind of sweetener, an election manifesto from
I don't
the
think the sweetener's going to work, to be brutally honest with you. I really don't think the sweetener's going to work. The $150 when they're a promise. They're a promise. The biggest thing the Australians are looking for is transparency that they promised, and we keep getting these FOIs back that are all just blanked out. Nothing's been done there. Actually, they're probably less transparent than what the 9 years the Liberal Party was. You
think the Labor Party's less transparent?
Yes, I do. I'm calling them out for that today. They've been I think we've been so let down on them making that promise that has been a real problem. That is going to present a problem for them in the election. People have had a gutful and they want more transparency. Why do you hide things up here? Why do you need to hide them? I just don't understand that.
Now, the other big issue that's playing out in the Parliament and clearly in your state of Tasmania is in relation to salmon farming. There's a big dispute on this issue. It seems that the Coalition and Labor are sort of agreeing to this emergency legislation, but a lot of the independents are not convinced. They say that basically this goes too far, this legislation, and it peels back environmental rights. How do you see it?
Well, first of all, the legislation hasn't been to a committee, which is dangerous in itself. And secondly, now that we're all looking at, we don't even think this will actually fix the problem, what we're looking at, but it might suck some other people in. So this might come back to bite. the Labor Party and that the Liberal Party is standing by here, I have to ask, because the majority of Tasmanians do not want the salmon farming going on in those harbours or too close to our shores. That's all we're asking. We don't understand how a multinational company that's making huge profits, that's paid no tax for 3 years, while we're sucking $37 million, this is a waste of money. $37 million instead of making them pay it to put oxygen in the harbour. Now, if there's no problem there, why are you putting more oxygen in the harbour? This is a Tony Burke thing. I want to make this very clear. This is Tony Burke's stinky mess from 2012 when he nearly doubled the size in that Macquarie Harbour. This is their cover-up. I'm calling you out for that today, Burke, because this is their cover-up. It has made an absolute stinking mess down there. No farmer in their right mind leaves the same vegetable in the same paddock for 10 years. They don't do that because it destroys the paddock and the vegetable, but we're happy to put those salmon nets, leave them there for year in, year out in the same place. Can you imagine that dirty, stinky mess that is under it? So, you know, it's not just about the skate, but there's other alternatives. It said these multinationals, they don't want to make them do it. Okay. We could be doing salmon on land. We could be doing salmon further out.
The government says this is about protecting jobs and
there's 22 jobs down there in Strawn. So while they're carrying on about 5,000 jobs and indirect jobs, that is absolute rubbish. I live down there. Most of it is automated. I want to make this quite clear. And everything is pressed from headquarters. They just press the buttons, the feed goes in. So this is bloody rubbish and they're going to be caught out.
Then? What do you see it as? What's the motivation then?
I don't know, Australian Workers Union for a small amount. You can't tell me that's $37 million. You could remove those people, move them with a removalist and find them and retrain them into a new job. That's absolute rubbish. You could do that and you could do that tomorrow. So this is rubbish. This is bull. They are going to pay the price for this in Tasmania. I mentioned this during the state run over the stadium, and this stadium with them, both of those major parties backing that stadium down there in Tasmania and backing salmon, I tell you what, they're completely on the nose. I'll be honest with you. But you know what, Tasmanians, just go to that white Senate ticket and put one in there for Jacqui Lambie, because that will finally teach them a lesson.
Jacqui Lambie's made it an election ad.
Yeah, no, bugger them.
I've got to stop that here
That's
on the
where
ABC.
they're coming.
Jacqui Lambie, that was very cheeky of you. You're about to go into the budget lockup now and have a look. Then Peter Dutton will deliver his reply on Thursday night. Looks like he's going to announce a gas reservation policy. Does that sound like a good idea?
Well, yeah, that depends on what it is going to be pushed anyway, because you'll see what's coming out with Rex Patrick in the next few hours in the news, but it's an absolute beauty because...
What, you want to give us the exclusive?
Well,
I'm happy to get it.
Sure, because Matthias
Cormann, who was our finance minister.
Yes, when he was in finance minister.
I can't fact check this, but please tell me.
So he'd already done a deal with Rex Patrick back then and said that they would do the gas reserve policy, and they haven't. So I don't think they're coming out with that 15% gas reserve policy. I think they're coming out with something else that doesn't even look like it, and I don't think it'll take the cake whatsoever.
Saying Rex had a deal with the coalition?
That's right. Back then, and they didn't do it back then, so we're just wondering what they're up to. So until I see that in black and white, I want to know what their policy is. But quite frankly...
And what does he say? They reneged on their deal?
Yeah, they've reneged on their deal. They could have been happening, but so we could have had that happening in 2019.
2019?
Yep.
Really interesting.
Yep.
Senator...
So let's see how they go.
I'll let you go into the budget lockup.
Oh, great. I'm so looking forward to that.
You want to stay here, don't you?
I'm doing a Tom Cruise and jumping out of my chair. Jeez, if I stay here for much longer, PK, I might lose
Does that make me
those extra 5 kilos I might lose off me butt.
I'm sweating it out too here in the Parliament. Senator Jacqui Lambie, it's always a pleasure to speak to you.
Good on you. Thanks for having me on.
Federal budgets in Australia are a big deal for governments and always engender a lot of colour and movement. Of course, the main event is yet to happen, the Treasurer's speech, which he will hand down later tonight. Here's a sample of how the day has played out so far.
The Treasurer will be delivering Labor's fourth budget at 7:30 tonight, clearing the way for the Prime Minister to call an election in May.
Everyone good? Well, budget out tonight.
Well, big day, fourth budget today during one term.
Tonight's budget will be a responsible budget. It will help with the cost of living.
Oh, thank you.
We need a budget for the next 5 years and beyond, not just for the next 5 weeks.
Lots of numbers, flip it around.
Tonight's budget is really more about whether the government's capable of restoring this lost standard of living.
So an election-winning budget?
What we're about is doing the right thing.
shall move to questions without notice. Are there any questions? And I'll give the call to the Honourable, the Leader of the Opposition.
We've had the largest fall in living standards in history. Our country is divided. 29,000 small businesses have gone broke.
Order.
And this Prime Minister's record adds up to nothing. How can struggling Australian families and businesses possibly afford another 3 years of the Albanese government?
Tonight we will hand down a budget that confirms the fact that inflation is going down.
Order.
And what we have
Members
done,
on my
and
left.
you'll see more tonight, is provide cost of living relief because we understand that Australians have been under pressure.
Well, one thing we already know not to expect in this federal budget, unless there's a surprise that no one's anticipated, is huge tax reform. Much to the disappointment of many economists who have complained about bracket creep being used to finance government spending. In an ideal world, what should governments be doing? Because we're on the cusp of an election, so we could have a new government. What should the next government be doing beyond just tonight? Kristen Sobeck is a tax economist from the ANU and joins me now. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for the invitation, Patricia.
Could you explain for our viewers who are not across all of the language just what bracket creep actually is and how it assists governments?
Sure. So bracket creep is when, as you earn more money, inflation pushes you into a higher income tax bracket. The problem with that is because because inflation is doing it, your purchasing power isn't increasing. And at the same time, because you're pushed into this higher income tax bracket, your disposable income, the amount of money you take home, is actually going down. So if you will, when inflation is high and bracket creep is in effect, the time when you need the money the most is when you have the least of it.
Right. And governments of all colours and persuasions have relied on it, because what happens when bracket creep creeps up, if I can use it? Like, what happens to government revenues?
So bracket creep is bad for workers, but from the perspective of the government, it's actually quite good, especially in inflationary periods, because people go up the brackets a lot faster.
So they're paying more tax.
That's right. So they're paying more tax. And this is actually good in an inflationary environment because it's the precise time when a government wants to rein in spending. So bracket creep is actually great for governments in an inflationary period, but not so great for workers. The other important part to bear in mind of this is when we think about bracket creep, people who are impacted by bracket creep are individuals who pay income tax. So in Australia, when we think about that, it's important to know that, well, personal income tax and corporate income tax are where we draw our largest sources of revenue. When you scratch beneath the surface a bit further, however, what we know is that the individuals who pay income tax are primarily individuals in their 30s, 40s and 50s. So when we think about bracket creep and individuals who are impacted, it's really working age Australians, those who don't pay income tax, who've aged out of the income tax system, largely retirees, or those with very, very low incomes. They're not impacted.
We've got the first budget deficit that will be delivered tonight. The Treasurer has confirmed that that's the case. This comes at the back of two surpluses. Do you consider this to be a significant development? What do you make of the fact that we have now deficits going into the next decade?
Well, I think as you've alluded to in previous segments of this show, we have a structural deficit, and that's for the foreseeable future. We are encountering, as far as the horizon can see, greater expenditure, and we don't have enough revenue to meet it. So what this is speaking to is truly a need for tax reform. We truly, truly, truly need a government. We actually need bipartisan support to enact tax reform in the years to come.
So if we were to get to a point, and I can't see it happening quickly or no evidence of it, but of coming to a point of agreeing on tax reform, how far-ranging would it need to be to deal with that structural problem we have where we're not bringing in enough money for the stuff we're paying for?
Yeah, so I think what you're asking for is my wish list.
Yep, I am, but in a fancier way.
I have a very big wish list, but perhaps I'll start with just the item that's at the top of that list. If in my benevolent dictatorship where I got to enact tax reform, the first thing on my list would be the transition from stamp duty to land tax. And there's three primary reasons where I would focus on this particular area, the transition from stamp duty to land tax. The first is that when we think about it, actually has to do with equity. So the first is when we look at individuals who actually own real estate in Australia and we compare them to individuals who don't own real estate, what we see is that individuals, property owners, are disproportionately wealthier. So in a sense, if we were to introduce a broad-based property tax, it would be very equitable because it would be targeting those with greater means to pay. The second reason that this is kind of at the top of my list is because of the extra money that it would generate. So first, we would do two things. Again, in my benevolent dictatorship, there are two things I would do. So the first is I would use the extra revenue to attempt to start to correct this structural deficit. But the other thing that I would use it for would be to reduce personal income tax rates. And the reason for that is because in doing so, we could recalibrate, rebalance how the parts of the population that we actually collect or tax from. So I often think of, I have a 4-year-old little girl, and she likes to build these really big towers with Duplo blocks. And anyone who has a grandchild or a small little child know that they try to build it as high as possible. And I try to liken that to, that is what our corporate or our tax system looks like at the moment. It's a teetering tower, and we just keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller on top, and eventually it's going to fall. And what we want is actually a broad-based, stable structure.
So essentially changing where we get the tax from.
Correct.
Right? So that does mean that workers, people who earn wages, would pay less tax under your perfect scenario.
Well, it means they would probably win. So obviously, young people wouldn't pay the property tax because they don't own property. And they'd also benefit from reductions in personal income tax rates. People in the middle, probably about my age, I own property and I'm also a wage earner. So I would have to pay my property tax, but I'd get a bit of a reduction in my personal income tax. So the balance would kind of depend on the type of housing I live in and my income. And those who are retired individuals, so individuals who have effectively aged out of the income tax system, would have to pay some tax, but they weren't paying any personal income tax before, so it's just a bit less. And so I guess the third point of why this is at the top of my list is the quantum, because I anticipate you might have been asking me how much. And this is where we really need some modelling, but I can give you a good indication of, so I have some colleagues at the Tax and Transfer Policy Institute, Trevor Rose and Robert Brunig, and right after COVID, they did some modelling to work out how much, to pay off the COVID debt, this debt that we've amassed so quickly, how much would we have to raise with a broad-based property tax? And what they found is if you instituted a 0.1% federal land tax, that would be enough over 33 years. So what that amounts to is if you had a property worth $1 million, you would pay $1,000 annually in property tax. That's not much. It's less than $100 a month. It's, in a sense, more than what some people spend on coffee, I believe.
It probably would be, which of course is not your job because you're actually not a politician, you're an economist, but it would be difficult, I think, to sell, and that's been ultimately the political problem here. So tonight the Federal Treasurer is delivering his 4th budget, but of course there's an election coming and the prism, I think, for this budget is a bit different to the other budgets. As you hear the debate that we've been having on this program since this afternoon, do you think we are having the political players who matter, who actually have power, do you think they're being real with us about what we need to do?
I think they're doing what they need to do, whereas what we need is a frank and honest conversation with the Australian public. That the Australian public, we know that as countries develop, they want more and better government services. I recently became an Aussie last month, and I'm so excited because I love this country, but I also love what all of this country believes in, a fair go. The fact that I had my child and the most expensive part was the parking at the hospital. It's an amazing place to live. And I think we just need to be more realistic have our frank, hard conversations with the Australian public that in a bipartisan way, if we want more and better services, we have to pay for them. And if we want more and better services for our old people and for our grandchildren, we have to do this in a way which is also more equitable.
We certainly have to deal with, what's coming in and what's going out, to say it colloquially. But in terms of the spending that we are doing, because we are accelerating spending, there's been a lot of spending announcements. Of course, if you're going to benefit from some of those spending announcements, you might think it's wonderful. Do you think it's reasonable, though, or is it too fast?
Is it reasonable or is it too fast? I think to give you an economist's answer, it probably depends. And I think that answer depends on what voters think. My personal views, I guess I'll keep to myself. Yeah. But I really do believe that it's up to the Australian public to decide how much we should be spending. But in saying that, in some ways, they already have, by nature of the demands for better aged care the demands for potentially universal childcare and the things which are out of our control, which are defence spending.
Now, the Treasurer delivers his budget his budget 7:30, and then the reply happens on Thursday. Where are you going to be watching the budget tonight?
From my living room.
Are you? Are you subjecting your 4-year-old to the budget?
No, I have to pick her up after this segment and race home.
I used to subject my children to the budget, and they're still recovering. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Allegra Spender, the independent MP for Wentworth, has been one of the leading voices for tax reform in Parliament. Continuing that tax discussion, I spoke to her a little earlier. Allegra Spender, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, you'll be going into the budget lockup and poring over the budget papers.
Yes.
But this is an odd budget. I think it's important to say that because it's really an election document. That's how I see it. How are you seeing it?
Look, I think it is, it's very much about the election, but what I do want it to be is about the next 10 years, not the next 2 months. And I think there's been so much focus on the election. But I think what a lot of people are telling me in my community is we're missing a national conversation about what is going to set us up for the long term rather than the sort of short-term pain that many households are dealing with right now.
Do you think 10 years is too long to, return to surplus? Does that worry you, the sort of time frame?
Look, it does. I'll be honest, it does, because 10 years is a long time. We've had 2 surpluses, over more than a decade. Those are the only 2 surpluses we've had. And I think there's a big question of, how do we pay for this? But it's also the question of, even if we're going to get back to surplus, how are we going to get back to surplus? And the problem is that's probably going to be through bracket creep, unless we do significant tax reform. And that really worries me because it is young people who are really struggling right now to hit the same milestones as their parents. They are struggling to buy houses. They are struggling to pay off their HECS debt. They are not even having kids at the same rate as previous generations. And our tax system, which is really focused on the income tax system, is burdens and bracket creep is an insidious tax rise every single year and is the only way that I think either of the major parties have a shot at ever getting back to surplus. And that's a problem for all of us.
Yeah, and neither of them have suggested changing that. The Coalition generally talks about wanting to deliver lower taxes, but we don't know anything specific. As you look at their 2 economic programs, is there one that you're leaning towards? Because neither of them will get necessarily enough seats to form government. They might have to rely on you.
Look, we don't know that much, really, honestly, about particularly the Coalition's economic plan. In terms of, the government's economic plan, the big questions I ask is, how do we pull spending into line? Because spending has grown really fast. And I know people have, heard a lot, and I know that there have been important, increases in wages of childcare workers and things like that. But we've grown spending really, really fast. We cannot continue to do that. But the other side is how do we drive productivity in our businesses? Again, that is the major driver of wages. That is the major driver of prosperity in this country. And you need to see reform. We need to see an EPBC Act that is reformed and passed through the Parliament. We need to see IR reform that makes it simpler to employ people. And we need to see a particular focus on low productivity sectors and the regulation, such as the construction industry and also some of the care industries.
You talk about spending being, too fast, and that's an issue. The government has announced lots of measures. PBS, bulk billing, 9 out of 10 people getting bulk billing is the aim. The energy bill relief, there's more.
Yeah.
Is there any of that you think goes too far?
Look, where I think the place to start, I would always start, is a lot of the infrastructure money that is being splashed around. And let's be honest, this is on both sides. Both the major parties here are throwing infrastructure money around, like it's confetti. But the problem with that is, where's the evidence base that this is the right way to spend that money? Where's the long-term infrastructure plan? Because we spend literally, over $10 billion a year on infrastructure here. We do not have strong cost-benefit analysis, and we do not have a strong time frame in terms of, this being part of a broader plan. And so I always think you start with infrastructure spending. In terms of those pieces of relief, they are really, really important to people. But the question is, are they the best dollar that we can spend right now? Or are there other reforms that are going to deliver better long-term bulk billing rates over time or better value, including, some GPs have come to talk to me and say, look, we're not sure about this because what we actually really need is longer consults to deal with chronic disease. So, there is still discussion discussion going on, even from some of the GPs in my electorate, about whether this is actually going to deliver what everybody wants. But there's, bipartisanship on spending more and more and more, but there's not a lot of clarity about sort of raising productivity and also how do we get spending under control.
If there is a community demand for some of this spending, right? We know the community, if you look at surveys, is saying that some of this spending are things that they want to see. They want to have better access to doctors that's cheaper. These are normal things that people have come to expect, and perhaps even more so. Don't we need to look at bringing in more revenue to pay for it?
Look, I think that there are different ways you can address this, and one is always to say, look, how do you spend, what the community cares about is outcomes, not necessarily it's got to be this program. What the community cares about is having access to affordable medical, good public education. And so one of the questions always has to be, how do we get those outcomes at the cheapest and most affordable way possible? For instance, preventative healthcare. We know that that is actually a long-term driver of reducing healthcare costs. That could be a path that either the major parties have gone down with the extra spending that could actually help our long-term healthcare costs rather than some of the areas where they're spending right now. So I think that's what the community is after. And, I keep on coming back to different types of reform, including, things on the planning system and, construction sector, because we have to go, how do we make things more affordable for people? That's why people are asking for help, because they're struggling. Housing is, the major driver of, household stress in terms of costs, and we need to work out how do we make it easier and more affordable to build houses. Now, that's not necessarily the government spending more money. That can be just about how do we do the right reforms to make that more possible.
Just wondering, if there's a minority government, whichever side, would you consider or seek a ministry?
No, I'm not after a ministry. I mean, what I am genuine... Look, because I've got in here because I want to see outcomes. It's not about, my career or where I'm going. And what I really want to see, what I will be pushing for, and I think this is the opportunity for minority government, is actually to push the reform that the majors are too scared to touch. I've been pushing tax reform for the last 3 years, and because it is a conversation the country knows that it needs to have. People come up to me in the street and say, thank you for pushing it, but the majors don't want to do it because they've wedged themselves so successfully. So what I really am seeking in the next parliament is an opportunity to talk about the tough stuff, because I think that is the way that we set ourselves up, for the prosperity of future generations, and that's our responsibility in my mind for parliamentarians.
Well, given you talk about the tough stuff, that means often there are losers.
Yeah.
And the big fear of the big political parties is in creating enemies.
Yeah, sure.
Because we know what happens when you create enemies. They generally campaign against you and make your life miserable, right? There's precedence of this. So until we get bipartisan support for big reforms, like happened with aged care, where actually, some people do have to now pay more, and yet we don't hear a lot about it. It's not going to happen, is it?
Look, I think there is an opportunity I genuinely think there's an opportunity in a minority government because, frankly, let's be honest, we haven't seen any tax reform from any majority government in the last 20 years. And I think you'll see myself and a lot of the independents on the crossbench serious about this. But, I think, what we need to get back to in reform is the why. Because you have to, firstly, you firstly have to see if the community believes in the purpose of the reform, because then you have a greater chance of getting people on board. And I come back to, why do I care about tax reform? Because young people are falling behind, because our businesses are less productive and investing less than they should, and that's bad for our economy, and because the energy is costing more than it should because we don't have the right tax settings. Now, if we can agree on the problems, and if we're serious, and if there's enough momentum around the issues we're trying to solve, then I think we have the greatest chance of actually driving reform.
Allegra Spender, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
To get a bit more political perspective on the excitement of budget day, let's bring in one half of my regular political panel, Liberal MP for Casey, Aaron Violi. Labor MP Luke Gosling unfortunately couldn't join us this afternoon. He's unwell, so take care, Luke, if you're watching.
Sure, he'll be tuning in.
So you get more time. I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing for you or how you're feeling about that, but you have no choice.
Absolutely.
Your side of politics has been very critical of Labor on their spending and also the rates of taxation under Labor. But would you actually reduce taxation if you were to be elected?
Well, Peter Dutton and the Coalition have said that we will, once we get the numbers, we'll get the books today and we'll look at what we can do in a responsible way. The Coalition has always been the party of lower taxes. We fundamentally believe that Australians should keep more of what they earn and we need to look to reduce tax. I mean, bracket creep is something that all Australians are are struggling with at the moment, paying more than $3,000 extra in tax. So it's a genuine challenge we need to face into. But we've said we want to look at it, but we need to do it in a responsible way. And until we see the budget situation, that's what we're going to have to make decisions on once we know the final numbers.
Some of your colleagues have been critical of Peter Dutton and Angus Taylor for not having a strong enough economic narrative. Is Thursday night the chance to prove and to show what the Coalition's economic agenda is going into this election?
Well, Peter said that on Thursday night we'll have some big announcements and we'll continue the conversation. But I must say respectfully, PK, that if you look back, the Coalition have had really strong economic policies out there. Divestiture of supermarkets, the strongest measures possible against Woolworths and Coles, is an economic policy. It is about reducing prices for Australians. Woolworths and Coles control 67% of the Australian market. I spent a decade working in the sector and I saw firsthand the behaviours and how that market share was used. And that's a policy that will bring prices down, make sure farmers and suppliers...
ACCC doesn't agree with you though.
Well, I'll back myself and my industry experience, suppliers that have worked in the industry that think it has... But
doesn't it concern you though that the Competition Commission, the group that's actually established to be independent and provide advice, says this isn't a good way forward?
Well, I think they're entitled to their opinion as an expert body. Our role as members of parliament and as a coalition is to bring my lived experience, suppliers, farmers' lived experience together to bring a policy forward. Divestiture isn't new. We've looked at it in the energy market when we were in government. Many countries, the US, UK, other countries use divestiture powers because ultimately, if you're an executive at Woolworths and Coles with the size of their business, with the profitability that they have, there is one thing that they protect above all else, and that's their market share. And they do look at things like land banking, using regulations to suit them. So you need to have something that is significant enough. And we've said we'll put guardrails in place. We'll put guardrails in place to make sure jobs aren't affected, to make sure communities where there's only one supermarket aren't impacted. So if you do it the right way, as we've proposed as a coalition, you can get these results of helping consumers with their prices, helping suppliers and helping farmers. And so we've been bold in that space. We've been bold with energy when it comes to nuclear. Peter and the coalition, we've said more gas needs to come into the system. So we're bringing forward changes, importantly, PK, that are structural changes, that'll make short-term and long-term changes. What we've seen with this government over 3 years...
Let me ask this before you get to your next talking point. But you all do it, so I'm not saying you're particularly guilty. But on this issue of divestiture, I spoke to Alan Fells, who's a former ACCC leader, of course. He does actually think your point on divestiture, he concedes. He thinks divestiture is important, but he talks about it as a broader power rather than picking off industries. Why not approach it that way? Because Peter Dutton's floated, whether it be the insurance industry. Why are you just choosing industries rather than having an overall power that could be used if you think this behaviour is going on?
Well, I think the key when you look at groceries is twofold. Every Australian is feeling the prices of groceries. It's something we all go through every day when we go to the shops, and so it's a particular need in grocery, and it's also a unique industry. I stand to be corrected. I don't know if there's any other industry in Australia where two players control 67% of the market. Obviously, we've got banks, we've got 4 banks, so, you look at insurance, there's more than 2.
There's no
so
doubt
there is
that they're extremely
There is
dominant.
a unique case for grocery that they've got unique needs.
Is there a unique case for insurance? Because there's been a bit of disunity on this issue.
Well, insurance companies, as Peter said, should be on notice that if a coalition government is elected, we will do what is needed to protect Australian consumers. Ultimately, same with Woolworths and Coles. If they're doing everything by the book and they're happy with their moral, ethical and legal behaviour, they've got nothing to fear from divestiture. And Peter has said we will do what we need to do to hold insurance companies to account. Because insurance, again, in my community, we've got the Dandenongs, the Yarra Valley, many disasters. We had a bushfire about 2 weeks ago, and I just want to quickly say to all the CFA volunteers that protected our community, thank you. So insurance is a big issue in my community with disasters. So whether it's the coverage that people have to pay, whether it's how quick they get the payments and the houses rebuild after storms and bushfires, insurance companies play a crucial role in our country and in our communities, and they should be doing the right thing. If they're not, we'll hold them to account.
Let me ask you this. There's a story in the Nine papers saying that Peter Dutton has said that the leaking has to stop to his party room. I mean, we're just a couple of minutes from an election. Why is there disunity now? What did you make of the opposition leader putting his foot down?
Well, I wouldn't say there's disunity, PK, and I'm certainly not going to discuss party room discussions. No one should be discussing party room discussions. For 3 years, we've seen a coalition that is united, that is focused on holding this government to account.
Something's shifted, hasn't it?
I wouldn't say anything's shifted. I think, if anything, if I'm honest, journalists have had 3 weeks where they thought they'd be campaigning, and they're looking for things to write, and they're making a lot of phone calls.
Journalists always look for things to write.
Well, they do. But you look at our track record, we're united behind Peter. There is no opposition that has spent more time leading the agenda. The government has responded on so many issues to our agenda, and we're seeing that. We know that there's 2 roles an opposition has to play. Show the Australian people and the government are doing it through their failures how bad it is, and there's no one better off today than there was 3 years ago, and put forward policies, which we've done and will continue to do, because an election hasn't been called yet. We've still got a 5 to 6 week campaign.
Final question. A little earlier, the ACTU President Michelle O'Neill said that they would like to see no compete clauses be removed, so that workers, if you're a hairdresser, that you're not stopped from going and quitting and getting another job. If this is in the budget and the government's clearly looking at it, I mean, she raised it, so I'm thinking it's very likely. Is that something you'd back?
Well, we'd have to see the detail. I mean, obviously, if the ACTU are raising something, they've got a direct line, as we know, to the Prime Minister and the Treasurer.
To the idea now?
Well, given their financial support. So to the idea, the detail matters. I mean, there are legitimate cases where non-compete clauses are important, been in corporate for 10 to 15 years prior to politics, and you have some proprietary information. So there is a legitimate need for them. But then there gets to questions around hairdressers and things where there's not that intellectual property. I think that is an ongoing discussion we need to have. I haven't heard Michelle's comments. I haven't seen any detail of it. It's a conversation I'm prepared to have, but until we see detail of it, we can't commit to anything.
Fair enough. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, VK.
Well, the Greens have an interesting budget wish list with calls to both tax big corporations and, unusually for the Progressive Party, they want more sovereign defence capability. I spoke to their leader, Adam Bandt, a little while ago. Adam Bandt, welcome to the program.
Hi, PK.
We know that there will be deficits for the decade ahead. That's what's projected. Are you comfortable with that projection, or do you think the government and perhaps the opposition should be putting more effort into bringing that back?
Well, it's obviously budget's about both revenue and spending, and 1 in 3 big corporations pays no tax in this country, and in the coal and gas sector, it's closer to 1 in 2 big corporations paying no tax. Now, our tax revenue for big corporations, especially those in coal and gas, it's an international laughingstock, right? Other countries manage to collect tax from the resources that all Australians own, and yet the government comes to every budget and says, well, there's not enough money, we're going to be in deficit, and yet lets these big corporations off the hook. I'm hoping tonight that we will see some measures to make these 1 in 3 big corporations pay tax, but I'm not holding my breath.
So you want higher taxes in tonight's budget?
Well, we've got on those big corporations, like not on everyday people, like everyday people are already struggling to make ends meet. But how is it that a nurse pays more tax than a multinational gas corporation? Like, how is that fair? Like, we've got some big gas corporations, ExxonMobil, $15 billion revenue in 1 year, pays no tax. Now, and in many instances, they even get the gas for free. Right? They get the gas for free. Show me another business, small business, that gets its material costs provided free by the government. Now, if we made these big corporations start paying their fair share of tax, close those loopholes that see these gas corporations manage to get away with paying nothing, we could fund things like getting dental and mental health into Medicare, seeing the GP for free, wiping student debt. We could do all of those things. So when the government says, oh, look, we've got constraints, well, no, go and make those big corporations pay their fair share,
it's
and
easy
then we
to
can
say
start to
that
do things.
It's easy to make lots of these claims, but then you've got to actually get these things through the Parliament. Katy Gallagher, the Finance Minister, talked about the fact that the superannuation reform, which is, changing the tax arrangements there, what she describes as a small measure, not everyone would agree, but she describes can't get through the Senate as it is. I mean, if that's the kind of situation the government is in with just one measure, how can it possibly do what you're suggesting?
Well, lots of things have got through the Parliament. There's a lot of pieces of legislation have passed this Parliament, and it's often involved a bit of compromise from people. I think it would be incredibly popular to say, if we said, look, it's wrong that 1 in 3 big corporations pays no tax. We're going to use these last few days of Parliament to make them pay their fair share of tax and use that to fund measures that will deliver real cost of living relief to people. Like, let's lock in seeing the GP for free. Let's Dutton-proof that and pass that in legislation, fund it by making the big corporations pay their fair share. Now, I think it would be incredibly popular, and I think the reason they don't do it isn't because they can't get it through the Senate. There'd be the numbers there to get it through the Senate. The reason they don't do it is that they take donations from these big coal and gas corporations, and so they're reluctant to take them on.
You mentioned gas. The opposition is likely to introduce a new gas reservation policy likely on Thursday night, but of course we have to wait for that to happen. What do you make of that idea?
So, I'd say a couple of things. One is that Australia is awash with gas. It's just we send most of it overseas.
Well, yeah,
often
that's the point of the
tax-free.
policy, right?
And so what we know at the moment, though, is that these big gas corporations are actually now dipping into the domestic market, taking gas away from households and businesses in Australia to use it to send overseas. Now, one of the things that we could do is stop those big corporations from taking gas from the domestic market to send overseas. Now, it got to the point where it's about 22 petajoules this year. It's going to get, within the next decade, it's going to be about half of what the manufacturing sector uses, the equivalent. Let's just stop them from raiding the domestic market and sending it overseas. That would go a long way. And then we don't need to open up new gas fields, because what Labor and the Coalition want to do is also keep opening up new gas fields. And in the middle of a climate crisis, we just can't afford that. So our proposal, I guess, firstly, we would say stop them raiding the domestic market. They shouldn't be able to send it overseas tax-free when people are going without.
That's partly clearly the direction the Coalition's moving in, right?
Well, but then they'll say, oh, well, we've said the problem is, what's happening is these gas corporations are raiding it from the domestic market and then crying that there's a shortfall, and so they need to be given the fast track to open up new gas mines. They don't. They just need to stop raiding the domestic market, and then we can stop opening new coal and gas. The second thing I would say is that we've got to reduce the demand for gas, and it involves home electrification, for example, business electrification. Now, we've announced our policy to give households and businesses support to get things like batteries, to begin the electrification process, switch over to induction cooktops, that kind of thing. We hope we've started a bidding war. We hope that there's going to be policies on that front from Labor and even the Coalition as well. It's one area I'd be happily outbid on if that's what happens. We've seen some independents come out on this as well, because a lot of these forecasts from the Coalition, even from the operators, are based on just continuing to use the same amount of gas. And if we can give households some help to get off gas, we're going to cut power bills and cut pollution.
Just a couple of other issues. The government is introducing this legislation to protect communities who are salmon farming in Tasmania. They have bipartisan support. The Coalition supports this. In fact, they've been pushing for it for some time. What are your concerns around it? Because I don't think you can have that much impact on actually changing the legislation.
Well, this is devastating that the government's choosing budget week not to get GP for free or wipe student debt, but instead to put corporations before communities and rush through legislation that's going to gut our environment laws. The legislation doesn't mention salmon, doesn't mention Tasmania. It's a wholesale change to our environment laws that mean that even when there's scientific evidence, as is the case here, that says a species is on the verge of extinction, or in other cases it might be that it's going to fast-track climate collapse or destroy our environment, it's now removing the rights of that scientific evidence to be heard and taken into account by the Minister. It's a gutting of our environment and climate laws, with Labor and the Coalition joining together to ram this through under cover of the budget.
To community concerns around jobs and community protection, right? So there is a tension here between what you say and the sustainability of this community. Do you concede that this is difficult for a community that relies on these jobs?
These are big corporations that are driving a species to extinction.
But I'm talking about the
with
jobs,
the government's help. And the government's own briefing note says that there's 20 jobs in direct employment there, right? This is environment legislation. It's about ensuring that things are done in a sustainable way that protect the environment. Now, clearly, there's issues with the law at the moment. And instead of respecting the science and respecting the law and saying, well, maybe we shouldn't be sending a species extinct, the government's rushing through changes to the law. That won't fix the science. The science is the science and says that we are on the verge of extinction of this species and we need better environment laws, not gutting them.
Do you expect it to be legally challenged?
Well, there's a problem with rushing these pieces of legislation through. There's also the risk that, well, as we've seen, the initial analysis shows it's actually much broader than just Tasmania and salmon. This is going to remove communities' rights to challenge environmental devastation in their own backyard, to stop new coal and gas mines because it's going to fast-track the climate crisis. This is Anthony Albanese giving Peter Dutton exactly what he wants on the under the cover of the budget.
Final question. The Greens have announced a sort of plan B to AUKUS defence policy. I don't want you to go through the detail of it. It's all on the ABC website. It's really interesting. I want to go to the sort of premise of it, because many people in the left, and that's your side of politics, the progressive side, are kind of shocked that the Greens are leaning into this idea of investing big dollars in defence. What's changed?
We're basically saying now is not the time for Australia to be joined at the hip with Donald Trump's United States. Hoping that Donald Trump will ride to the rescue is a bad way for conducting defence policy. But that's what Labor and Liberal have done, with AUKUS in particular, but also with other areas.
And do you feel like the geopolitical situation we are in, the rise of China, the instability in our own region, means we are more vulnerable?
Well, what we need is a defence policy that is about defence of Australia, not about being part of Donald Trump's next attack mission somewhere else. I think you look at how Ukraine was left in the lurch. Hoping that Donald Trump will ride to your rescue is not a good way to conduct defence policy. And
well, there is a vulnerability because he's definitely an unreliable partner. Most people agree with that. So you do think we need to be better equipped to defend our country?
What we need is a defence force that is about defence, not about joining US military attacks. And that's what the AUKUS submarines are about. The AUKUS submarines are about being able to travel long distances and be part of the next US attack foray somewhere. And that paints a huge Donald Trump-shaped target on Australia's back. It does not make Australia safer. It is time to say, let's look at the defence spending and make sure it's actually about defending Australia, not about being part of Donald Trump's next attack.
Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, PK.
The working assumption of journalists and politicians alike is this federal budget will be the springboard to an election that will be called on Friday or Sunday or in a week after that, but very soon, to get the last glimpse of voter sentiment before the campaign starts in earnest. I want to bring in our regulars. Love to talk to them, love to pick their brains. Cos Samaras and Tony Barry from Redbridge Group. Hi, guys. I think I'm having some audio issues with you, but I will ask a question regardless, which is this. We know, of course, that the budget will be delivered tonight. There are many deficits ahead. How does the government, Cos, starting with you, have to handle this to get it right going into the election?
That are going to help the everyday Australian out there, particularly those in those key seats, get over what many Australians perceive as a pretty significant economic hurdle in their own homes. So I think tonight will be a continuation of that and will enable them to build on that narrative. They are in the business of trying to keep that momentum going. That's the momentum they've been building for the last 3 or 4 weeks. It's paying some dividends in the polling that we're seeing. And I think Jim Chalmers' focus will be to ensure that that continues.
Well, how do you read it, Tony? Because this week wasn't really meant to happen, but we've now got a budget being delivered tonight and the Parliament's sitting. And I can tell you, because I'm in the Parliament right now, it's a pretty intense feeling in this place. I mean, it's very unusual to have the Parliament sit so close to an election like this.
Yeah, I think in the same way that the change of the election date, or the apparent change of election date from 12th of April, whilst it obviously caught the government off guard, it also caught the opposition off guard. The government clearly had a few policies in the top drawer, some good ones in terms of polling sort of hitting their target markets. The PBS announcement just last week, which was also a cost of living dimension to it, was one such policy, whereas it looks like the coalition didn't have anything in the top drawer, so there's been a bit of drift, and consequently coalition MPs haven't had much to talk about, including the leader. And so the voters are picking up on that sort of Albanese government are more in the conversation at the moment. And so they've had a pretty good 2 weeks in terms of our polling.
Now, today there's a story out that's come out of the coalition party room. I want to put it to you first, Cos, where Peter Dutton has said that the leaking has to stop, referring to a couple of stories. We've talked about them here, where there has been leaking against Angus Taylor in relation to not having a good enough economic narrative. This is coalition MPs who've been leaking, and then the leader putting his foot down. Again, it's been leaked. So the leader saying don't leak has been leaked. What do you make of it, Cos?
I think on both sides of the political river, they have two speeds. One is arrogance, the other one is panic, and I think we're seeing a bit of panic on the coalition side at the moment. They all love to be winning in the polls, and the minute it starts to turn a bit ugly for them, we see this sort of behaviour. And we were seeing that with the Labor camp as well. Fortunately for both sides, the Australian public are paying very little attention to this.
Yeah, I mean, that is absolutely the benefit for whoever's having a hard time. Tony Barry, you've probably seen the story. Peter Dutton saying stop leaking. There is, also reporting, I've heard it myself from MPs, they feel like they might be on a hit list, people being targeted. This is not very helpful.
Yeah, I think the edict came out at 9:45 and Paul Sakal got it at 9:50 a.m. So that was a quick turnaround, even by Paul Sakal's excellent standards. But yeah, it's a very untidy story. It's just another example of how the coalition can't get back into the conversation at the moment. And there's a lot of self-harm going on. There's a lot of political self-harm going on across the board. The Teals as well, stealing signs. The coalition being very undisciplined. And in classic Labor fashion, when they're getting to the pointy end of the electoral cycle, they put away the knives and they mop up all the blood on the floor, their own blood, and they pull together. And we're seeing that quite a bit in the last few weeks. Also advantaged by the fact that Jim Chalmers controls the microphone now. I think you're going to see Jason Clare have a bigger role as well, two very good communicators, and they're getting the dividends of that right now.
Cos, Thursday night is the opposition leader's talking stick or microphone moment. What does he need to do to get, as Tony describes it, back into the conversation if there has been this drift?
Talk about the economy. I mean, if you've got an outer suburban strategy, which, we've now heard many times that from the coalition that is indeed their intent, and that is to win seats in the outer suburbs of this country's large cities, then you're going to have to be talking about the economy. Less about the culture wars, more about how you're going to actually help people get through not just the present challenges that they're facing, but also the concerns they have not just about themselves, but their kids. They're not going to win too many seats outside of Victoria if they do not talk about the economy, and that is fundamentally his challenge on Thursday, and that is to frame the launch of that coalition campaign squarely in the economic space.
And Tony Barry, I'm suspecting you agree with that, given all the research is showing people want cost of living and the economy to be the biggest issue that's addressed. So in that context, we've heard a bit about maybe a gas reservation policy to be announced on Thursday. Would that cut it? Would that really be something that the, regular people in the outer suburbs would engage with?
Yeah, look, it's probably a good policy on its merits, but they need to be simple, easy to understand policies. In the same way that, the sugar hit of the energy rebate is actually a very bad policy, but it's a very simple policy politically to understand. So you need to make these things very, very simple and digestible for that soft vote in the outer suburbs. A gas reserve has some complexity to it, so it requires quite a lot of messaging and selling, which is a challenge. But I think, we always sort of say budget and reply speeches matter, but they never do. this time it actually really does matter, and the coalition will need a big signature policy to effectively launch their campaign. And but my tummy compass says that the Prime Minister's office will unhelpfully brief out to the media at 7:20 p.m. that the election will be called the next day and atomise the media cycle. So,
do you think so, Cos? Do you think so too? That's the way the Prime Minister might game this?
It's imminent. There's no doubt that we are now very much at the eve of the election being called. We're practically in the middle of the campaign, and really the starter's gun's going to be fired, and that's when I think things will accelerate pretty quickly. But I'd be surprised if we don't see him visiting the Governor-General's house come this Sunday, maybe at the latest the following weekend.
Well, we are now waiting, aren't we? And of course, tonight the budget gets delivered, Parliament's sitting. You are always such great minds to mine for information. Thanks for joining us.
No problem. Thank you.
And that's afternoon briefing for today. Stay with us here on the ABC News channel. Joe O'Brien is up next with today's top stories. You can catch the ABC's budget coverage on ABC TV and right here on ABC News channel, which kicks off when the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, gets on his feet and delivers the budget. We, of course, are on iView. Afternoon briefing is how you find us. I'll see you tomorrow. Catch you then.
This is ABC News.